Imagine you are 18 years old. It's early June 1960. The day has been warm, the lake calm. Four friends, two young men, two young women, full of summer dreams, laughter, and the promise of freedom, pitch a tent by the shoreline of Lake Bodom in Espoo, Finland. There are Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson and his best friend Seppo Antero Boiman, both 18, and the two younger girls, 15-year-olds Mila Ermeli Björklund and Anya Talikimaki. They unpack their gear. They fish. They joke. They fall asleep under a sky of stars, lulled by the gentle lap of water against the shore. It should have been one of the simplest, most memorable nights of their lives. Instead, between approximately 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., something happened. A sound in the dark, a tearing of canvas, a flash of movement that none of them will fully remember. When dawn arrives, the tent lies collapsed, drenched in blood. Inside it, the bodies of Seppo, Mila, and Anya. Outside, Nils, alive, seriously injured, all questions in his eyes. Pause for a moment. Think. You're lying still, trusting that night, your friend's beside you. And then you wake to this. Your world turned upside down. What would you feel? Confusion? Fear? Grief? Would you understand what you're seeing? In this story, the survivor, Nils Gustafsson, is as much a witness as he becomes a suspect. From a moment the first birdwatchers spotted the collapsed tent to the claim of a tall, blond man walking away from the shore before the police arrived, every clue points to something that slipped away and stayed out of reach. For more than 6 decades, the question remains, what really happened at Lake Bodom? Who attacked those teenagers? Why were they targeted? And why has no one ever been convicted? Even more unsettling, could the person sitting next to you, the one you trust, hide the darkest of possibilities? Today, we step into the night of June 4th to 5th, 1960. We walk through the laughter, the darkness, the moment when life changed forever. We uncover the evidence, the questions, the theories that Finnish investigators carried for years and still carry today. We listen to survivors. We examine silent tents. We trace footprints that lead nowhere. By the end of this journey, you will be faced with your own conclusion. Did this happen to them? Or could it have happened to you? Keep your eyes open. History has shown that quiet lakes hold quiet memories, and sometimes the truth hides in plain sight. We begin at the edge of summer, 1960. In the quiet Finnish town of Espoo, just west of Helsinki, lies Lake Bodom, a serene inland lake surrounded by pine forest and water rippling in the dawn. For many, it was a place for fishing, swimming, the simple escape of a weekend by nature. But for 4 young friends, this lakeshore would become the backdrop of a horror no one could anticipate. There are places that seem untouched by time, places where the world feels simple, peaceful, safe. In the summer of 1960, that place was Lake Bodom, a quiet lake outside Espoo, Finland, the kind of spot where families picnicked, children swam, and teenagers found freedom under the open sky. But as history would later prove, even the most peaceful places can hold the darkest secrets. It was a different world then. Finland was rebuilding after the war, small towns growing, young people craving independence. Summers were short but magical. When school ended, the lakes called, thousands of them scattered across the country like mirrors of glass. For teenagers like Mila Ermeli Björklund and Anya Talikimaki, this was their moment. They'd worked hard all school year, and now, at 15, they wanted adventure, a night camping outdoors away from parents, surrounded by laughter and the smell of pine. Mila Björklund, kind, cheerful, and responsible. She loved writing letters and daydreaming about what life might bring. Her best friend, Anya Maki, was quieter, artistic, thoughtful, often the voice of reason when others took risks. Then there were the boys, both 18, freshly navigating adulthood. Seppo Boiman, tall, confident, a natural leader. And his close friend, Nils Gustafsson, more laid-back, funny, and fiercely loyal. Between the 4 of them, it was an easy friendship. They joked, teased, and shared the kind of bond that makes summer feel endless. That June, they decided to go camping, just for one night. A small adventure, nothing more. Or so they thought. June 4th, 1960. The group packed their bicycles, a few blankets, sandwiches, soft drinks, a small canvas tent, and a radio. They pedaled from Espoo toward Lake Bodom, laughing along the way. The road was quiet, lined with birch and pine. They reached the lake around noon. The air was warm, 25 degrees Celsius, and the water shimmered like polished glass. They found a perfect spot on the shore, near a patch of trees that offered shade from the afternoon sun. No one else camped nearby, just birds, insects, and the stillness of early summer. As the sun dipped low, the group shared dinner. They swam, dried off by the fire, and listened to music from their small radio. Neighbors later said they saw the tent's lantern glowing faintly around 11 p.m. It was, by all accounts, a normal night. No one reported shouting. No loud arguments. Just the sounds of wind, laughter, and then silence. For most, that silence would mean peace. For them, it would soon mean terror. Sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., something happened at that campsite. Something no one has ever fully explained. A knife tearing through the tent. A struggle in the dark. 3 people, Seppo, Mila, and Anya, would never see daylight again. The fourth, Nils Gustafsson, would survive barely. Bloodied, disoriented, and forever changed. At 11 a.m., 2 local birdwatchers walked along the lake's edge. They noticed a collapsed tent. At first, they thought the campers were still asleep, until they saw the blood. Inside the tent, Mila, Anya, and Seppo, lifeless. Outside, on top of the tent, Nils Gustafsson, unconscious, covered in wounds, his shoes missing. The birdwatchers ran for help, and within an hour, police and ambulances arrived at the scene. What they found would baffle investigators for decades. A crime scene that made no sense. No clear footprints, no murder weapon, and no signs of robbery. Whoever had done it had vanished without a trace. When Nils woke in the hospital, his memory was scattered. He had a concussion, a fractured jaw, and deep knife wounds. He said he'd seen a shadow, a man outside the tent. But everything after that gone. Police tried to piece together his words, but nothing fit. How could one person do this so brutally, so quietly, and leave no trace? Even decades later, that same question echoes. Was Nils a victim, or something else? The Lake Bodom murders would haunt Finland for generations. A case with no witnesses, no murder weapon, no confession, and endless theories. In the days to come, suspicion would fall on strangers, on friends, even on the only survivor himself. But that's a story for another act. For now, what remains is this. 4 friends went camping by a lake. 3 never returned home, and one would spend the rest of his life trying to remember what truly happened in the dark. Every summer, people still visit Lake Bodom. They swim, they laugh, they picnic, and they whisper about the night when innocence met its end. Because even after 60 years, the lake remembers, even if no one else truly does. When officers first arrived at Lake Bodom that Sunday morning in June 1960, they were not prepared for what they found. Finland wasn't used to murders like this. Not in small, peaceful Espoo. Not at a quiet lakeside camp. This was the kind of story that happened somewhere else. Not here. But by noon, it was clear this was no accident and no ordinary crime. The tent had been slashed from the outside. Multiple cuts, long, uneven, tearing through canvas like paper. Inside lay the bodies of Seppo Boiman and the 2 girls, Mila Björklund and Anya Maki. Mila had been attacked, most brutally, evidence suggesting the killer targeted her specifically. And then there was Nils Gustafsson, the only survivor. He was found lying partially on top of the tent, covered in blood, with severe facial injuries. The immediate question was simple. What happened here? But every answer that followed only raised more questions. In the first few hours, investigators tried to secure the area, but mistakes were already being made. Curious onlookers wandered too close. Footprints blurred. Pieces of evidence, small, almost invisible, may have been destroyed before anyone realized their importance. Some locals even took souvenirs. By the time forensic teams arrived, the scene had been trampled. It was a critical mistake, one that would haunt the investigation for decades. What they did find was strange. The victims' bicycles were still nearby, untouched. A pair of shoes belonging to Nils was missing. A wallet and keys were gone, but the killer hadn't taken money or valuables. One of the tent poles was bent, suggesting a violent struggle. And then, a report came from a witness who claimed to have seen something. A local man said he spotted a tall blonde man walking away from the scene early that morning. He seemed calm, almost casual, but no one ever identified him. Who was he? A killer? Or just a fisherman who stumbled into the wrong story? By the next day, the murders were front-page news. Every Finnish paper carried the story. Lake Bodom murders shocked the nation. People were terrified. Parents forbade their children from camping outdoors. And suddenly, everyone in Espoo had a theory. Some said it was a local drifter. Others whispered about a jealous lover, a foreign soldier, or even a vengeful spirit from old Finnish folklore. In a country where such crimes were rare, the human imagination filled every gap the evidence left empty. While the public speculated, detectives turned to the only person who could have seen the killer, Nils Gustafsson. But Nils's memory was fractured. He said he'd seen a shadow outside the tent, a figure in black, moving silently. Then pain, chaos, and darkness. He couldn't remember anything else. Doctors explained his injuries, a concussion, multiple fractures, knife wounds, consistent with being attacked while asleep. But some investigators weren't convinced. If the killer had been outside the tent, why had Nils survived? Why were his shoes missing? And why were his bloodstains inconsistent with the others? For the first time, the unthinkable thought began to surface. Could the survivor know more than he claimed? As the weeks passed, rumors spread faster than facts. Some locals said they'd seen the group arguing earlier that evening. Others claimed to have heard shouting across the lake, though no one could agree on what time. The press amplified every detail. Soon, theories outnumbered truths. The Lake Bodom murders had become both a tragedy and a national obsession. Days later, a fisherman reported finding something floating near the shoreline, a shoe. It matched Nils's missing pair. But the condition was strange. The laces intact, the leather clean, almost as if it had been placed there later. To the police, it felt like a taunt. Someone was playing with them. Weeks turned into months. Hundreds of leads, dead ends. The police interviewed suspects, retraced every step, and even consulted psychiatrists and foreign experts. But nothing added up. There was no motive, no clear suspect, and no murder weapon ever found. It was as if the killer had appeared out of the forest, done the unthinkable, and vanished into thin air. For the victims' families, the loss was unbearable. Mila, Anya, Seppo, all buried within days. The funerals drew hundreds. Parents wept beside small wooden coffins, asking the same question the police could not answer. Why? And for Nils Gustafsson, survival came with its own burden. He was alive, yes, but he would carry the weight of that night forever. Some said he was lucky. Others whispered that he was hiding something. Either way, he would never escape the shadow of Lake Bodom. By autumn, the case had gone cold. Without hard evidence, investigators could only speculate. But even as winter blanketed the lake, questions remained alive in people's minds. Who killed those teenagers? Why was Nils spared? And what secret lay buried in that tent by the water? For years, those questions would haunt Finland, and every summer, someone would return to Lake Bodom, staring at the calm surface, wondering if the answers were still hidden beneath. Sometimes, silence is louder than truth. And at Lake Bodom, the silence had just begun. For years after that summer morning in 1960, Lake Bodom sat in silence. Calm on the surface, haunted beneath. The police had no weapon, no witnesses, and no confession. Only questions. And in the absence of answers, whispers began to fill the air. The first major suspect came from a single statement. A man camping nearby said he'd seen a tall, blond man leaving the lake early that morning. He wore a brown jacket and moved quickly, as if trying not to be seen. Locals described him as odd, quiet, someone who lived alone in the woods. His name was Valdemar Gillstrom. a kiosk owner who lived near the campsite. People in town called him the Kiosk Man. He was known for his temper, especially toward young campers who littered or made noise. He'd thrown stones at people before and even threatened teenagers who swam near his property. When police questioned him, Gyllström denied everything. He claimed he'd been home that night, asleep. There was no evidence linking him directly to the murders. But neighbors said he'd been acting strange afterward, drinking heavily, muttering to himself about the lake. Years later, in 1969, he drowned himself in Lake Bodom, the same waters where the murders took place. Was it guilt, or just coincidence? To this day, no one knows. Another theory emerged from an entirely different direction. Some investigators began to suspect a foreign soldier, possibly someone stationed in Finland during the Cold War. There had been reports of foreign uniforms spotted in the area, and witnesses described a man who didn't speak Finnish well. One name that surfaced was Hans Assmann, a German-born man living nearby. Assmann had a troubling past, rumored ties to Nazi Germany and Soviet intelligence. He'd allegedly shown up at a Helsinki hospital the day after the murders, covered in dirt, with his fingernails black and his clothes stained. When doctors asked what had happened, he became defensive, even violent. Police later said he had an alibi, but the timing was never clear. And when journalists asked him years later if he was connected to the Lake Bodom murders, he smiled and refused to answer. A haunting silence from a man who seemed to enjoy the attention. Through the 1960s and 70s, the case slowly faded from the headlines. Finland moved on, but the families didn't. Detectives retired. Files yellowed with age. And yet, every few years, a new witness appeared. Someone would claim to have seen something. A knife found in the woods. A rumor of a confession overheard in a bar. Each time, investigators returned to Lake Bodom, and each time they left with nothing. It seemed as though the truth had vanished into the forest. Then, 44 years later, the silence broke. In 2004, Finnish police reopened the Lake Bodom case, this time armed with new technology. DNA testing had advanced. Forensic science had evolved, and stored evidence from 1960 was re-examined. What they found changed everything. Blood samples from the tent and surrounding area were tested. The results showed that one of the blood types didn't match the victim's. It belonged to Nils Gustafsson, the survivor. At first glance, that seemed obvious. He had been injured too, but the distribution of the blood told a different story. It was found on top of the victims, not beneath them. That detail raised a horrifying question. Could Nils have attacked his friends after all? In March 2004, Finnish authorities arrested Nils Gustafsson, then 62 years old. The headlines were explosive. Survivor of Lake Bodom murders arrested for the crime. The man who had lived in silence for decades was now accused of being the very killer he'd claimed to fear. The theory? That a drunken fight broke out among the friends. That Nils, jealous or enraged, attacked the others in a violent rage, then staged the scene to look like an outside attack. It was a story that shocked Finland and divided it. Half believed the police had finally solved the mystery. The other half couldn't accept that the quiet young man who lost everything could be guilty. The trial began in 2005, nearly 45 years after the crime. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the DNA evidence. They said his injuries were self-inflicted or exaggerated. They said jealousy over Mila, his girlfriend, had driven him to kill. But Nils's defense argued that the evidence was misinterpreted, that forensic contamination and the chaos at the crime scene made reliable conclusions impossible. They pointed out that Nils had a fractured jaw, deep wounds, injuries too severe to be self-inflicted, and that witnesses had seen strangers near the campsite that morning. It became a battle between science, memory, and time itself. After months of testimony, the court reached its decision. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The court ruled that the evidence was not strong enough to prove guilt beyond doubt. For the first time in his life, Nils wept publicly, but not from joy. He told reporters, "No verdict can bring them back. I have lived this nightmare my whole life." He returned to his quiet life, but he never gave another interview about that night. Even after the trial, theories still swirled. Some believe Valdemar Gillstrom, the kiosk man, confessed before his death, a story his widow denied. Others are convinced Hans Assmann, the mysterious German, was involved, citing his strange hospital visit and cryptic behavior. And some, even now, suspect Nils may have known more than he ever revealed. But there's one truth no one can deny. After 6 decades, the case remains unsolved. Today, Lake Bodom is peaceful again. Families camp there. Teenagers swim in the same waters where tragedy struck. Life continues, but the past lingers quietly beneath. Every so often, someone pauses by the memorial stone that bears the victims' names. They read, they remember, and they wonder. The Lake Bodom murders changed Finland, not only for what was lost that night, but for what was never found. The truth. Because even when time heals, questions remain. And somewhere, in the calm reflection of Lake Bodom, 3 young friends sleep, while one man and an entire nation still search for answers. Every generation in Finland knows the name Lake Bodom. For some, it's just a story told by their grandparents, a whispered warning about camping near the woods. But for others, it's not just a legend, it's a scar. Because when the news broke in June 1960, it didn't just shatter 3 families. It shook an entire nation that had never seen a crime so brutal, so senseless, and so unresolved. For the families of Anya Talikimäki, Mila Ermeli Björklund, and Seppo Antero Boiman, life became something divided, before that night and after. Anya's parents could never bear to visit the lake again. Mila's mother kept her daughter's photograph on the mantle until the day she died. She said she wanted to keep one eye open, waiting for the truth. And Seppo's father wrote a letter every year to the police, not to demand justice, but to remind them his son's life still mattered. Time passed, but grief, unlike evidence, doesn't fade with age. The Lake Bodom murders weren't just a crime. They became part of Finland's collective consciousness. In the 1960s, it changed how people camped. Parents told their children to stay close to home. Hikers began locking their tents at night, something unheard of before. It also changed how the Finnish police investigated crime. Until that time, there were no dedicated forensic units. The failure to preserve the Bodom crime scene, with crowds of onlookers trampling evidence, led to a complete reform of investigative procedures in Finland. The tragedy had forced the nation to modernize its justice system at the cost of 3 young lives. For decades, detectives returned to the same question. Who could have done this and why? One investigator, Penny Hamalainen, spent over 30 years studying every detail of the case. He retired without finding answers, but his notes filled thousands of pages. The Lake Bodom murders became more than a mystery. They became an obsession for anyone who dared to seek the truth. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation rediscovered the story. It wasn't just the older Finns who remembered. Now it was journalists, filmmakers, and podcast hosts who kept the case alive. The story of Lake Bodom inspired books, documentaries, even a horror film, each one blurring the line between fact and fiction, truth and myth. But to those who lived through it, this was never entertainment. It was a reminder of real lives lost and justice denied. The fascination with the mystery speaks to something deeper, our need to understand the unknowable, to make sense of chaos, to believe that truth, somehow, still exists, even when buried beneath decades of silence. In 2020, Finnish authorities confirmed that some evidence from the case still exists, preserved, sealed, and awaiting possible retesting with newer DNA methods. For true crime enthusiasts and cold case investigators, this announcement reignited hope. Maybe technology could finally do what time and testimony could not. But experts warn that DNA alone cannot tell the full story. It can identify, but it cannot explain. And the Lake Bodom case isn't just about identity. It's about motive, fear, friendship, and betrayal. For decades, the only man who might have known the truth, Nils Gustafsson, kept his silence. After his acquittal, he retreated from public life completely. He refused interviews, avoided reporters, and lived out his remaining years in private. Friends said he struggled with nightmares and depression. He was haunted not just by what people believed, but by what he could never forget. Whether he was a victim or something more, he carried the weight of that night until the end. Every year, people still visit the site where the tent once stood. There's no official marker there, no plaque, no fence. Just the forest, the water, and the echo of memories. Some leaf flowers. Some come to film videos for their channels. And some come simply to stand in silence, to feel the weight of the mystery that has refused to die. In the stillness, it's easy to imagine the laughter of those four teenagers echoing faintly through the trees. A reminder that before this became a mystery, it was just a summer trip. Over 60 years later, the Lake Bodom murders continue to be one of Europe's most famous unsolved crimes. It's a story that refuses to rest, not because of the blood that was spilled, but because of the truth that still hides in the shadows. For some, it's about fear, how quickly life can change in a single night. For others, it's about justice, a belief that even after decades, someone, somewhere, knows the answer. And for the families, it's about peace that never came. The Lake Bodom murders began as a story about four friends on a summer adventure. It became one of the most haunting mysteries in modern crime history. We may never know who wielded the knife, who walked away from that tent under the fading moonlight, or why 3 lives were taken while 1 was spared. But every time the wind passes through the trees of Bodom, every time the water ripples beneath the sky, it feels like the lake is still whispering, still keeping its secrets close. And maybe that's why we can't look away, because deep down, we all want to know what really happened that night. Not just to understand the killer, but to understand the darkness and the fragility inside us all. The mystery doesn't end here. Subscribe now and join us as we uncover more chilling, unsolved cases.